Hello and welcome to MarCloud's webinar on navigating your Pardot to HubSpot migration. We're going to talk about timelines, data and costs. Please feel free to use the chat, ask any questions throughout the webinar, as I'll be answering them at the very end. So throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to Pardot, account engagement, maybe Marketing Cloud. By all these things, I mean the same thing. I use them interchangeably, but what I'm referring to is Pardot. So very quick introduction to myself. So I'm Tom, founded MarCloud back in 2017. It was very dramatic. It's off the back of a volcano erupting, but that's a story for another day. I've got 10 plus years experience in marketing operations, both client and agency side. So understand both sides of the fence. Salesforce marketing champion. So I understand the ecosystem very well and have been using Pardot since 2015. And I do rate it as a good tool, but we're talking today about moving from Pardot over to HubSpot. So who are MarCloud? Just an introduction to us. We're the Salesforce and HubSpot marketing automation experts. We're very good at what we do, very highly rated, and we support B2B clients across the globe on both platforms. So much so that we've developed our own framework that we call the ROI framework, and that's our structure to get the most out of your marketing automation platform. And lastly, we're ISO 27001 certified, so we take data very seriously. So what we're here for today is to talk about why teams are actually migrating over to HubSpot from Pardot, because that does feel like the general direction of travel at the moment. Migration basics and what's possible. We'll talk about cutover strategies. We'll talk about timelines, costs, and then lastly, we'll give you a 5-step framework to sense check if your migration is going to go through smoothly and seamlessly, which is exactly what we all want as marketing operations professionals. So first off, so why teams are actually moving. So in a nutshell, the basics are done very, very well in one place. So something I hear quite a lot from Pardot users is the difficulty with the email builder. There being free email builders, it being quite difficult to use. The ability to use ad management or ad campaigns alongside social is very strong in HubSpot. So there's this campaign approach, which is much easier to navigate in HubSpot than it is Pardot. I also hear the word clunky come up quite a lot when talking to Pardot users, and HubSpot's very easy to use, and marketers tend to have that familiarity having used the system before. Then there's AI, which is, I'm sure everyone's heard of. That's very baked into the HubSpot platform. So you can create drag and drop assets that are actually quite good and aligned to your brand. There's the ability to generate new content, whether it's social, landing pages, emails, and all sorts of things to help you get campaigns live quicker. And then there's other nice information, for example, pipeline analysis if you have the CRM, and the ability to analyze your campaigns quickly and reliably with a platform like HubSpot. Then there's the all-in-one code base approach, marketing, sales, and service. And some of our more regulated clients in financial services or healthcare, pharmaceuticals, they have a real emphasis on where their data resides. And HubSpot gives you the option to keep that in the EU or the US or wherever you want to sort of keep your data. And then lastly, the integration piece is really important. So the marketplace is very rich for HubSpot. And then on top of that, you can connect to OpenAI, you can connect to Claude. And we've actually got some nice use cases coming up to do with PDF analysis and red, amber, green statuses and sales analysis that will eventually turn into case studies later on. So we'll start with the basics and what's possible. So things to watch out for and mistakes that some companies make when looking at any sort of migration, but specifically a marketing automation platform one. The first one is forgetting the people. So sometimes we can be so embedded in the tech that we forget that the people need to come along with us. So there's a very big change management piece to ensure that once the system stood up and it's live, that the people actually use it in the new way of working and that they don't bring their bad practices potentially from the old system over to the new, because sometimes that can then lead to failure further down the line. So that training and enablement piece is really, really important. The second part, and this comes up quite a lot in conversations, is my data safe? So for example, it could be certain reports, or it could be historic deal information, or it could be certain opted in consent information. There's a real emphasis around, if we move platform, is my data safe? I want to make sure nothing is lost. And that whole data preservation piece needs to be carefully mapped out. Then there's the people doing the migration. So sometimes this is internal, sometimes this is via partners, but in any case, you want to ensure that they're not a sort of non-technical agency, and they're not coming at it from a pure CRM perspective, because sometimes that can lead to mistranslation of Pardot, for example, over to HubSpot, and it kind of leads to this lift and shift scenario where you kind of just bring everything across and you've just got Pardot with a HubSpot skin, if that makes sense. Then there's the planning that goes behind the timelines. So you need to start with the end in mind, and sometimes this aligns to your Pardot end of contract with Salesforce. In other cases, it might be a different type of event. But in any case, you should work backwards, and we'll go through the timelines a little bit later on, which will then dictate how and when you should actually approach this type of migration. Then there's the cutover strategy, which tells you how to move across, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a couple more slides, but that's a really important piece as well. So most migrations don't fail immediately, they fail quietly a little bit later on, and today is all about how we avoid that. So first of all, recapping on how the integrations work is quite important. So what you'll notice is that Marketing Cloud engagement, account engagement, Pardot, and HubSpot kind of all connect into Sales Cloud in the same way, in that they all have a connector. Essentially, they're all third-party platforms that plug into Sales Cloud. So if you think about it from this really basic view, you unplug Pardot and you plug in HubSpot. Super basic way to say it, but that's the gist. The only difference here is when you look at a platform called Marketing Cloud Next or Encore, Growth or Advanced, Salesforce love their names. That's an actual Encore platform that's within that little ecosystem bubble there. Really important to understand how this works, because this is part of that migration approach. So leading on then, so a lot of companies who migrate from Pardot over to HubSpot, they still keep Sales Cloud, and that's quite common. So in this instance, you would lead on what's quite a robust connector in the HubSpot Salesforce integration. However, whenever you migrate across, you need to carefully define how this behavior works, not just from an object perspective. You know, you might have custom objects and so on, but the sync behavior is really, really key. So there's certain properties or fields that need to map together. Then there's also the direction of the sync. So what I mean by that is, in some instances, you might have some contacts in HubSpot that you don't necessarily want to put into Salesforce yet. So what we can do there is we can align it potentially with lifecycle stages. So when we say, as soon as a contact reaches an MQL status, that's when we're going to allow them into Salesforce. And then there's the opposite. So you might be a regulated industry, and you only want a subset of your data to sync across for marketing use, and the rest of the data needs to remain hidden. So in that instance, it blocks what syncs across from Salesforce to HubSpot, and we can manage that via what's called a selective sync, where we configure the integration to only see certain things. And then lastly, HubSpot works in a slightly different way to Pardot, in that it has marketing contacts. So 1 month you might have 5,000 contacts being marketed to, and the next month you might have a different 5,000, so you can swap them over. So you can kind of play around with your costs in that scenario. So then there's the translation exercise. So Pardot has a certain way of working, and you want to be able to translate that over into how HubSpot works. So HubSpot is driven very much via lifecycle stages. That's on the right-hand side. That's the default subscriber through to evangelist. Whereas Marketing Cloud platforms tend to be tied to Salesforce architecture. Now, the main difference there is around leads and how leads are managed. So in Pardot, you have a prospect, and that will link to either a lead or a contact. Now, in HubSpot, you have a contact that links to the same thing, but you also have a lead object in HubSpot. And the way that I like to describe this is a lead in HubSpot is like a thing to chase, a thing to go after. And it could be an inquiry, for example. So me, I'm the contact, and I might make 5 inquiries at your company. So therefore there's 5 leads, and each of those 5 leads can be assigned to different people, because I might manage 5 different service lines, and you treat it accordingly to the correct team. And all of that information rolls up into the contact level, so you can see everything that I'm doing, which is a single view of the customer. So there's a really, really nice approach there, but it's important to note that the HubSpot lead object does not link to the Salesforce lead object, and there's a difference between the two. Similarly, HubSpot campaigns are different to Salesforce campaigns. You should treat them as completely separate objects. So before we look at a migration project, we should look at how we're going to approach campaign attribution modeling, because in some instances, companies might want to lean heavily on the HubSpot reporting and the HubSpot campaign attribution modeling, which is very good, or some companies might want to continue using Salesforce campaigns if that's a part of their normal workflow. So that part needs to be defined. HubSpot can reassign owners, and in Pardot, this is just not a thing. In Pardot, if you try to reassign, it will just sync back and overwrite. So in HubSpot, you can reassign, and that's an important distinction when you move platforms, because it unlocks many more possibilities, but it can also lead to mistakes. So it's really important to be aware of that fact. And then lastly, GDPR compliance and consent is handled, in my opinion, a lot more maturely in HubSpot, where you have different options to adhere to GDPR and CAN spam, whereas in Pardot, you probably set up a manual process with a custom field. Again, that needs to be mapped across into HubSpot. So feel free to take a screenshot of this table on the right-hand side. So this is a really sort of top-level, light, introductory way of how we get a sense of how much effort a migration might take. So we would put the number of users, the number of prospects, and so on, and explain what's going on within that particular asset area. Most Pardot orgs we see are quite disorganized. There's quite a lot of legacy and technical debt. There might be loads of files or old files that aren't used, engagement studios that aren't turned on, those types of things. So we need to really audit the instance, understand what works well, understand what needs to come across, so that we can understand what the effort level actually is. And in a lot of migrations that we've done, we have intentionally left a lot of things behind because we don't want to bring across bad things in the new instance. So we should also review things from a business process perspective. So it's all well and good looking at the tech. It's great to look at, line items of lists and so on. But if we zoom out and think about why we're actually moving, what business processes are important, and what's ultimately going to lead to more revenue or more leads for sales, for example, that's how we should be viewing the migration, because it's a very good chance to reset. We can do this by mapping out what the must-have processes are, the nice-to-haves, and not needed. So there might be some things that just are easier to do in HubSpot that you can't do in Pardot, or that you've built a clunky workflow to try and achieve. We can leave that behind and go to the new way of working. If you get this part right, then the migration becomes a lot easier because we can see what we're working with. This is a nice tip or a nice piece of awareness, because in a lot of migrations, the standard approach is to leave behind all the prospect activities. And these are the really granular bits of information. So the email opens, email clicks, page visits, Google search, and so on. You can actually bring that across. And we've done this for a number of clients now, where we've extracted all of this granular information, and you might keep it in a BI tool. So maybe Looker Studio, Power BI, or even HubSpot. You can introduce this data into HubSpot if you have enterprise. It won't be available on Pro. So this is for the more, it tends to be high value, low volume type companies, where some of this engagement data is really, really important. However, for those that don't bring this across, we can still capture the essence of what we're trying to do here, where we create lists or tags where we say, this is the Pardot score or the Pardot grade, to give us a sense of how accurate of an ICP they are, or even their last activity or when they were contacted last. We can bring all that across in lists. You've got 2 options there. So just to touch a little bit on cutover strategies, because this is often overlooked, and this is pretty much how will you stop using Pardot. So there's 4 core ways of any cutover strategy, and this can apply to CRM, it can apply to service or marketing. You might run a pilot. If you're a large organization, you want to run a pilot just to see if it works, dip your toe in, and once it does work, that's when you start to move things over, and you'd pick one of the other 3 cutover strategies. It might be an immediate cutover. Now, this tends to happen when the Salesforce license expires. The company's get in a rush and they say, January 29th is the hard stop, and then we must be on HubSpot. So therefore, that would be an immediate cutover strategy. The other approach is a phased approach. So it might be that you're moving certain teams over. It could be geographical. You might have a UK team that you move over, then a US team, and so on. And then there's a parallel cutover. And we've worked on some of these for organizations where they have a bit of time, their license doesn't expire for quite a while, and they want some time to be able to move things over just in case they need it. And that tends to be for the more, with the bigger budgets, you've got more time to relax, more time to breathe, and you've got the freedom to do that. I think most companies would opt for parallel if they could, if budgets weren't a thing, because that tends to be like the safest and easiest. It does come with its own flaws though, because it means that there's no rush to move over, and it can cause confusion as to what is the system of record. On to typical timelines and costs then, so the fun bit. So timeline wise, and this is all finger in the air stuff, but it's a good ballpark for you to work with. Assuming a successful audit, and we understand exactly what the lay of the land looks like, we know what our business processes are, a light migration could typically take 4 to 6 weeks. And that's when you're dealing with standard data, standard objects, and it's a pretty straightforward, light account. Medium migrations tend to be 6 to 8 weeks, and that could include custom objects. There might be a live journey that we need to move across, but there tends to be a slightly more that we're working with. And then complex migrations, that tends to involve more closely aligned processes that are linked to Sales Cloud. There's live journeys, lots of assets. That could take 8 to 12 weeks, but again, finger in the air, it just depends on the level of complexity. In terms of costs, so this is a complete rule of thumb based on experience. So you've got the onboarding fee. So if you're moving to Marketing Hub Pro, for example, that fee is $2,500 and Enterprise is $6,000. You want to add that number to roughly 20 to 30% of your HubSpot license cost. Now, this can vary wildly depending on your business, but that's roughly the rule of thumb when you're thinking about getting a budget for this. It just seems to work out within that kind of range. And then you have the Salesforce integration piece. You definitely want to allocate some level of time towards that integration to ensure that you're set up for success. Now, the image on the right is quite important here, because if you've been sent a proposal and it looks good, it's fast, it's going to be delivered in time, and it's really cheap, it's probably a red flag. You can only really have 2 of those at once, as a rule, again, a rule of thumb. So a correctly priced migration should feel like an investment. You should avoid cheap, really, if you want it to be good. And if you're integrating with Salesforce, just definitely expect that time to be allocated to the integration, because it's a really important part that's going to set you up for success later on. Costs change, and it completely depends on the business, but consider what automation you're bringing across, what needs to be translated, what needs to be built or rebuilt, sorry. If anything's live, that needs to be rebuilt. So if someone's halfway through a journey, how do we get them across into the new system? Do we let them continue down the Pardot route? And again, this will be dictated by your cutover strategy. So think about how that's going to work. And then lastly, the critical business data. What needs to move across, how quickly, and how sensitive is the data? So 5 steps then to tick off and to ensure that you've got a successful migration planned. You need to think about, first of all, the audit, discovery, and why. And the why alludes to change management. So let's get a plan in place, let's see what we're working with, and then bring the people on the journey with us. Phase 2, that's the onboarding, that's getting the HubSpot instance stood up. Number 3 is the configuration and testing. So this is now fine-tuning it and tailoring it to your business, and then testing those processes. Phase 4, moving the assets across. Normally that's a targeted migration. So we understand what we need to rebuild versus what we need to move across data-wise. And then lastly, really, really important piece, training, go live day aligned to the cutover strategy and support. A lot of companies will offer hypercare, and that's a really good thing to ensure that the next couple of weeks goes really, really smoothly. So each of these steps are mandatory. If you skip a step, that tends to be where things go wrong. Please feel free to reach out to me via the website. Happy to sanity check, even if you're already working with a partner, happy to have a chat and sort of help with your migration. No obligation to work with us. It's just a sense check of what's going on with your instance. So we'll move to the Q&A. Hopefully that was helpful. We got some questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat if you have any. And yes, there will be a recording sent automatically after we end the session. So we have one question. So if we have an existing Salesforce org and use Pardot and are thinking about moving to HubSpot, would that be a smoother transition? So yeah, I mean, yeah, this is absolutely fine. I mean, this is very common. So it's an existing Salesforce org using Pardot. It's going back to that integration piece we talked about. You can essentially follow the migration framework to move over to HubSpot. Absolutely. So we can help with this. Feel free to have a chat after the webinar. So what is the best way to onboard new users on HubSpot? Should they use the HubSpot Academy training or create a custom training? So HubSpot are really good for the amount of content that they have. There tends to be a lot of free resources available, and that tends to be a really good starting point. It's when I would recommend, once they've got the basics from HubSpot's own training, and you want to go deeper and you want to do some real sort of clever things with integrations, sort of deeper dive, that's when I would reach out to a company like MarCloud for sort of custom training. But HubSpot resources are really, really good.
Sorry, I don't understand.
And you will be assigned a customer success manager with HubSpot, and they can help as well. So we currently use Salesforce and Pardot and Sprout Social for our social media scheduling. Could HubSpot also take care of our social media scheduling? Yes, it can. Quite a lot of companies actually move to HubSpot because it reduces the costs elsewhere. So for social media posting, for ad management, for litmus testing, for Shutterstock, just little things that you can kind of decommission once you're on HubSpot. So the answer is yes, you can replace Sprout Social with HubSpot. We just moved to Pardot, from Pardot to Marketing Cloud Advanced. What is your opinion, Marketing Cloud Advanced versus HubSpot? Good question. So they're two very different platforms. So Marketing Cloud Advanced is built on Data Cloud, and that is it's a technical system. So if you're looking for unified profiles, if you've got lots of data coming in from different places, for example, we're speaking to someone using Snowflake, they want to bring that data into Data Cloud, then it becomes very, very powerful, and all the subsequent automation off the back of it. HubSpot for me is a lot more user-friendly, and it takes a more marketing operations campaign approach to things. So I think that the way that the campaigns are built in HubSpot are more aligned to a traditional marketer and a marketing operations person versus Marketing Cloud Advanced, which I think is much more geared towards AI. It's more agent-driven, and it is built on that Data Cloud, more technical approach, especially when you start to think about journeys being built on flow. That's quite a technical place, or can be a technical place. So I would probably say Marketing Cloud Advanced tends to do better with the more technical teams, if you have that skill set within your team. Hopefully that answers your question. Amazing. If we don't have any more questions, then thank you very much, Phil, for coming today. You will be sent a recording after we hit an end event, and hopefully we will speak separately very soon. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.